Are we up and running?
We are, and I think we're ready when you are, Dr. Glen.
Okay, thank you very much. So welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion focusing on learning to live with COVID-19, national security issues, and the global supply chain. I can tell you that on the several of these type of presentations that I've done, they've primarily been associated with what type of mask should I wear, what type of virus is it, which are all important topics, but there's some other very important issues that are of national and international concern that are going to be addressed in this particular roundtable. So this group, this presentation is actually a collaboration of the Scowcroft Institute in the Bush School here at Texas A&M University and the Dentons law firm. So the first thing I'm going to do is introduce the panel. And I'll tell you that beforehand, we decided to use first names. So we're not being disrespectful of anyone as we move forward. So first we have Rosemary Gibson. She's a senior advisor at the Hastings Center and author of the book China RX. And so I'm going to hold this up just to be shameless. Can I make it? That's interesting. The book actually disappears. Trust me, she wrote this book. So, and I'll try to show it again later. Our second contributor is Thurbert Baker, who's the former United States Attorney General, and Dr. Eleftherios Iakovou, who is a professor and director in manufacturing and logistics innovation at the Texas Engineering Experiment Station. And he's also the associate director of supply chain management. So, three highly qualified individuals with different backgrounds. My name, as I said, is Glen Laine. I'm a senior fellow at the Scowcroft Institute at the Bush School in pandemic and biosecurity policy. And I'm also a Regents professor and director of the DeBakey Institute for Medical Devices and research leadership here at Texas A&M University. So I'm going to start off with just a few comments just to initiate the discussion. And then in the same order in which I introduce people, I'm going to have each person spend a few minutes just giving us some perspective about supply chains and national security. So I'll tell you that most folks who've been watching the news are familiar with supply chain issues as they relate to personal protective equipment, PPE, maybe a little bit on medications that are manufactured in places that may not have a strong supply chain. And I'm telling you that we are about to have another interesting or significant event associated with supply chains, and it has everything to do with vaccines and how to distribute them. The states have been basically put on notice by the federal government that we want to be able to start administering vaccines as soon as the vaccines have been accredited safe by the Food and Drug Administration. And the president has funded money, has provided monies for production of vaccine to the most promising candidates. So we don't have to wait some months after FDA approves the vaccines. We can start production immediately. Okay, having started production, there are some other issues that need to be considered. Like vaccine has to be put in glass vials. And there may or may not be sufficient glass for those vials. There's a needle situation. There are people that actually have to give the vaccines. Another example, which has been a problem with other vaccines, is there's something called the cold chain. So most vaccines have to be kept cold, somewhere between 0 and -80 degrees. Now, if you have to keep something at minus 80 degrees, those vaccines will have to be sent to medical centers, places that have those kinds of facilities for those temperatures. Other vaccines only have to be kept at a temperature similar to that found in the refrigerator, the freezer section of your refrigerator at home. And those vaccines would be the ones that would be distributed widely throughout the country to places that may not have other super freezing capacities. And remember, this vaccine has to be located in a truck somewhere in order to get from the facilities here to the points of administration. So these are just a few ideas, and I'm going to throw a couple of numbers on the table just so for some perspective. So we have a facility here at Texas A&M University, which will be producing something between 100 and 200 million doses of vaccine, which will obviously have to be distributed and administered. And for perspective, there's some 350 million people in the United States. And if you look closely, you will see that the government has approved monies for manufacturing and distribution of many more vaccine doses than we would typically need just for the United States. And it's been clear that there are 8 billion people in the world, and we will try to do our best to generate sufficient vaccine and have an acceptable supply chain so that, for instance, if vaccines have to go to other countries or other continents like Africa that may not have the refrigeration capacity that we have, there may be other considerations. So I bring these things up only to show that the supply chain is important. It's important to national security, and we are about to face an interesting supply chain event. So now I'm going to let others have some introductory comments. And Rosemary.
Glenn, thank you so much for that great introduction. You know, in the days of Amazon, you know, we're used to going on to our computers or phones and with a few clicks have product just delivered on our doorstep. And we don't think much about where it came from or how it got there and who supplied it. And I think you're right, the global pandemic has given us and forced us to look at these things called supply chains. Where do things come from? Who's making them? And do we have enough to go around? In the work that I've been doing the last several years, I was looking at a really unknown dependency that we have. And it's our essential drugs. These are generic drugs used in Texas hospitals and hospitals all over the country and around the world. They're used in ICUs, they're in emergency rooms. And these are the generics, which are 90% of the medicines that we all take. Well, it turns out these are not the vaccines. These are the medicines during the coronavirus pandemic when hundreds of thousands and more people were hospitalized. These are the medicines doctors use to help them recover, to help them go home and live. You know, these are medicines used for, say, for people on ventilators. You know, you need a sedative, you need muscle relaxants, we need antibiotics. And what the world found out very clearly is that supply chain for the core components to make hundreds, really thousands of basic generic drugs that we use every day in our healthcare system, that supply chain is highly centralized. So we learned 3 things. One, we had 100 countries affected by the pandemic, and all those countries were competing for the same supply of the components of these medicines that are life-saving. The second thing that we learned, and this is predictable, that there were more than 70 countries that were banning exports of these essential drugs because they needed them for their own people. And so it's not something that you can rely on your neighbor for to help out in a global pandemic. And the third thing that we're seeing, which I think is a very positive move, and I'm sure we can talk more about this in our discussion, that many countries and regions like the EU are saying, what do we need to produce domestically? not everything, but what are those things that are so essential to life for survival of people that we need to produce at home for our health security and certainly our national security. And we've seen bills introduced in Congress and many other policy steps. So this has become a hot topic and a very welcome one. So we're better prepared next time.
Thank you. Thurbert.
Thank you so much, Glenn and Rosemary, for those words. And let me thank all of those who are joining us from near or far virtually today. It is how we live nowadays, and what an honor it is to appear before you, even if we can't meet in person. But Glenn, thank you so much for the introductions here today. And I have to tell you, it is indeed an honor for me to join this very distinguished panel. And I want to say at the outset, that Dentons law firm is a big supporter of the Bush School, its mission and focus on public service. I spent over 23 years in public service myself, so this is something, and what Bush School does is something near and dear to my heart. We're here today to discuss a global pandemic, which is critically important to our firm, given that we are the world's largest law firm, covering some 76 countries and employing over 19,000 people at last count. We strongly believe that Dentons should be in and of the communities we serve around the world. And no country, as we all know, has been left untouched by COVID-19. So the conversation today is both critical, in my opinion, and timely as we all seek out lessons learned and, more importantly, best practices as we move forward. I've noticed some broad themes emerge in our country's response to this pandemic, and I've been looking at it with a keen eye toward the interaction between government at all levels and the private sector and civil society. But we've seen some themes emerge, and it's caused us to, first of all, re-examine our nation state form of government. Not to get legal, but as many of you will recall, the 9th Amendment reserves to the state all powers not expressly given to the federal government. And so what we literally have is a federal government that most look to for direction and guidance during the midst of a pandemic, but a form of government in which 50 states basically can make their own decisions about what they want to do and how they want to do it. Most people recall us saying, all responses and all crises are local. And that's basically what we're talking about. States get to decide and governors get to decide what they want to do, how they want to do it, and when they want to do it. There's no national law that requires all 50 governors to meet in Washington, D.C. to sit down with the president and try to map out a strategy. So this pandemic has caused us to think about and to relook at our form of government. But we're also taking a hard look at the level of collaboration between the various levels, local, state, the private sector, and civil society. We're looking hard at the agencies and what they do, in particular FEMA and HHS, and those agencies that take a lead role in the midst of pandemics. Surprising to me to learn that, for example, FEMA, under its statutory authority, does not list a pandemic, Glenn. I mean, I was a little bit surprised to see that. Nor does it list cyber as one of its missions, which sometimes can cause delay in how quickly and how efficiently a leading agency should and can respond. The pandemic has to focus even more on how we communicate. Not only how we communicate, but with whom. And since timing is so critical when we communicate, how we have prepared and whether or not regional disasters have properly equipped us to deal with a global pandemic. There are many out there now who are of the opinion, Rosemary and Eleftherios, that, we really have not prepared ourselves as a result of regional disasters, hurricanes and, flooding and wildfires, that those things have not literally prepared us for a global pandemic. And so we are re-examining now the lessons we've learned there. Security, health concerns, medicines are all very lively topics that we will discuss here today. I'm excited about this panel. I'm going to learn a lot from those who are talking here today. Don't all of it, Glen, but I'm sure this will be a very lively discussion. Thank you all so much for letting me join.
Thank you. So, but before we go on, I've been told that I need to say one thing, and that is, as folks are listening to this this conversation, formulate some questions, and you can send them in via chat to Trudy Bennett. At the end of this group discussion, we'll try to address some of your questions. So, Eleftherios, I'm going on to you.
Glenn, thank you. Let me start by saying I'm truly humbled to participate in such a distinguished and interdisciplinary group. Thurbert, Rosemary, Thurbert, Glenn, it's a privilege and pleasure being here. I want to thank the Scowcroft and especially the director, Andrew Natchez, for his leadership, his passion about pandemics and preparation. So the Bush School has done a tremendous job there. And Glenn, I'm also having a courtesy appointment at the Bush, where we start, and I'm excited about this, with Raymond Robertson, the director of the Mosbacher, a new global value chains program this fall. So it's a privilege. Let me say a few words. First of all, as an engineer, allow me to say, with different managerial pedigrees, we need to define what we're talking about. So in a supply chain, allow me for a few seconds to be academic. The mantra is we do 5 activities. We plan, we buy, we source, that is, around the globe. We make, we move, we distribute, and sell. And going back to the importance of supply chains that Glenn so well articulated, let me say that the reason that shareholders experience this great return on investments in the US stock market is because the efficiencies of the globalized supply chains, Glenn, the support of the publicly traded companies. Let's not forget that. And we have done tremendously well. So the driver for this globalized supply chains is supply chains that compete, not just businesses. It has always been high return on investment. We live in a capitalistic society, and allow me to say that we fight for supporting the view of liberal democracy as a prerequisite of economic growth against some adversaries that I don't want to mention necessarily here. If we remember, the reason we have this globalized trade is because of the US leadership following 45, following World War II. Trade will bring stability and peace. In 1990, we have US signing NAFTA. 2001, China entering WTO, along with containerized cargo, the simple box that's called container. Financial deregulation, we had the bloom. We had a boom of global trade, global supply chains, just indicative. 1990, global trade was about 39% of global GDP. Before exactly the point that we have the financial crisis, it raised up to 61%. And after the financial crisis, we start having what the economist calls globalization. Already we had shrinkage of global supply chains up to 2019. The percentage from 61% of GDP, global GDP, went down to 58%. And now, the icing on the cake, COVID-19 arrives and exacerbates constructive structural problems that these global supply chains have had for a long time. Since I'm in Texas A&M and the vast audience here is Texas A&M, allow me to use a military term. COVID is nothing but an example of today's VUCA environment: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And indeed will be reshaping manufacturing supply chains in ways that we haven't thought about it. First and foremost, because I want to wrap without bothering you too much, both the federal government and the private folks understand that we cannot focus anymore only on economic virtue, but we also have to think about resilience. And Glen, if you allow me later down the road, I will be happy to talk about what is supply chain resilience and what is important. As Rosemary said, during the pandemic, we experienced dramatic surges in demand for some supply chains, such as groceries, household, dramatic reductions in non-health related, health-related surges, but not only surges in demand, Glen, but demand that will move spatially around the country as the hotspots will dynamically evolve. And it became clear that the just-in-time or the cost-efficient models of most of the manufacturers couldn't deal with that. There's no one-size-fits-all, and I would like for us and the audience to start thinking about it. We have to talk differently about supply chains critical for the nation, such as PPE, pharmaceuticals, defense, that's very important for us, as opposed to consumables, electronics that are not necessarily critical for the defense of the nation. So supply chains are stratified. There are lessons to be learned from the private sector towards the federal government and vice versa. The collaboration between the feds and the private sector is imperative to develop new models, because supply chain resilience, Glen, means additional costs. Somebody has to absorb the cost. Just indicatively, today there are 50 pieces of legislation at the Hill in Washington, D.C. for secure and resilient manufacturing supply chains. I hope we all spend time together working, not just today, to understand the complexity of what we're talking about and appreciating the fact that there's no one-size-fits-all of this. So I look forward to the continuation of this exciting event.
Great, thank you, Eleftherios. So I've written down a few directions in which we might go. And one of the first, and I guess I get to choose this because I've got the list in front of me. In Rosemary's book, there was some good descriptions just of cases that people may not be aware of in this country as to where their pharmaceuticals arise, where they come from. And I think even more interesting, who the suppliers are. You know, where do the raw materials come from? And if we could get Rosemary to comment on that, and then I'd like to get Thurbert to talk a little bit about what the legal ramifications are when folks demanded to know where their pharmaceuticals came from. I think there were some folks that just said, no, that's proprietary information. So Rosemary, would you kick us off in that direction?
Sure, thank you, Glenn. You know, as the pandemic was beginning to emerge, I was having dinner with a group of pharmaceutical engineers. These are the people who are in the plants actually making product. And so I went down a list of 10 or 12 basic medicines that are needed to care for people with coronavirus who are sick enough to be hospitalized so they could go home and get better. And so I went around the table and I said, so, it's not just the pills or the vials, but these are made with, chemicals. Our medicines are basically chemicals formulated to help cure disease. And I said, so where do these core chemicals come from for these basic medicines to treat hospitalized patients? And this is a group of people that had about 150 years combined experience in manufacturing. And each of them said at least 90% of the core chemicals were centralized in China, and hence the title of the book, China RX. And so we had this extraordinary phenomenon of, where a pandemic is centered, or where it got, in that whole region. That is also a place where there's a lot of manufacturing of basic antibiotics and other critical components in our drugs. So we had this perfect storm that caused disruption in supplies of essential drugs. It didn't get as much headline news as the PPE did, the masks and gowns, but behind the scenes, there was a lot of angst and back and forth among companies. And we did have shortages of critical drugs like epinephrine on ambulances. You need that. I was talking with a physician. He said, I was out on an ambulance in an urban area, and he said, I didn't have the proper vials of epinephrine, and I had to mix some things, took 2.5 minutes, and that's valuable time that a patient could survive or not. So we have learned a lot from this experience with the pandemic about the implications of centralizing our supply chain for critical drugs. And it's like having 90% of the world's supply of oil coming from a single place. So it really is prompting people across the spectrum in the government and industry. You know, what you said, Thurbert, is so right. We need to come together on all sides to figure out what's a better way to do this so we're much better prepared next time.
And just to follow up on Rosemary's thoughtful comments just now, it is an interesting dynamic we're seeing around the country as we try to deal with this pandemic and legal liabilities as such that might follow if meds aren't doing exactly what they should do. And, you know, as we all know here in the United States with the FDA and federal control over, you know, medicines and what should be told to people consuming those medicines, you know, we have a bit more comfort level as to what we have and what it ought to do. Not that it is always perfect, but we have a bit more. We are less comfortable when those medicines are coming from a foreign country. And Rosemary, to your book, China RX, it is a perfect example when we don't know exactly what's in it or even if it's labeled appropriately. And so not to say that they aren't, but I think that is a level of concern that we see, you know, here in the US as we venture into this new space. There has been a lot of discussion around a couple of topics as we talk about sharing of information and what people have a right to know around medicines and other things that are happening during the course of this pandemic. There is an effort to sort of relook at FOIA, which, as we know, is the freedom historically to gather up a great deal of information by asking the right questions to the right agency in order to get the kind of information they might need. But there's been a lot of discussion as to whether or not FOIA, as we now know it, shields the ability of those to protect what they consider to be competitive information, confidential information, as it relates to their medical products. The other conversation that is ensuing right now focus on what we call safe harbor legislation. We are asking companies to engage and to look at, you know, experimental medications, whether or not there is going to be liability if they don't do exactly what they're supposed to do, and whether or not there should be some safe harbor against liability. Those are all very lively discussions that are ongoing right now. I don't think we've reached any conclusion on it, but I do think those legal challenges are out there. We are in kind of a new space right now as we're dealing with vaccine, COVID. But those conversations are going to continue, I think, until we've landed at a spot that most people are comfortable.
If I can just jump in with a quick point, those are great points, Thurbert. You know, the marketplace might be part of a solution here. I've been impressed with a startup nonprofit that is basically before coronavirus, very forward-looking. Beginning in 2018, they started creating new supply chain for critical generic drugs here in the US. And within 2 years, they started having production of 40 different critical medicines. And those 1,200 hospitals here in the US didn't have shortages. But one of the innovations is they have full transparency on where their finished product is made and where the core ingredient has come from. And they're proud of it. And they say, we have ours tested, which, you know, the FDA doesn't do. So this type of transparency can be a competitive advantage for some in a marketplace. And maybe that's a way to help get us through this as, you know, as hospitals, patients, and the public see, well, maybe we and policymakers need clarity from a national security perspective. So sometimes the market maybe the market will help us here.
Glenn, if I can add here to Rosemary's point, is that okay?
Please.
So I appreciate that comment about suppliers, and customers. And Rosemary, what a great example you brought up. I know Thurbert is very strong about how to develop trust along shareholders within the supply chain. And supply chain visibility and transparency, namely the ability to know across the supply chain what I have, is of utmost importance. But let me throw here a footnote. These global supply chains have become so convoluted over the years that it's so difficult to identify tier 2, tier 3 suppliers. I'll just give you an idea as an example. During the pandemic, tons of companies are trying to do what we call supply chain mapping. In other words, have illumination tools so they can see who are the suppliers. It takes them 6 to 12 months. After 2011, the tsunami that we had in Japan, I'm not going to name the company, global semiconductor giant, conducted supply chain mapping involving hundreds of their executives. It took them 1 year to unveil tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers to understand where they're really threatened, where they're really vulnerable upstream of the supply chain. I'm just echoing how difficult this is.
Great. So let me make a comment. When we've discussed these issues in the past, we're trying to think in terms of solutions. Now, we don't have solutions to every problem, but if we don't want to look backwards, we want to look forwards. And it's surprising some of the things that I've heard, people say, for instance, with vaccine or drug manufacturing, that we should just return everything to within the shores of the United States. Well, there's a couple of issues that come into play. Not the least of which, if there's an offshore manufacturer and we can confirm the quality of what they're manufacturing, and the price to manufacture that product is 10 times what it is, in another country, then there's always the possibility that companies will say, well, we're simply not going to make that drug anymore. And it in fact does happen. So there are some laws, and I'm going to talk about one here in just a second, that specify how much cheaper something would have to be. But there's no question that there are many things, medications that are based on chemical raw materials. Vaccines are slightly different in that there's the necessity in many cases to grow a microorganism and then deactivate it so you can make a vaccine. But I must tell you that the capacity to grow some of these organisms to generate vaccines are not present everywhere within the United States. And we're not going to talk about this, but we've been very fortunate that the federal government actually built several facilities around the country, including one here at Texas A&M University, that's basically obliged to manufacture these vaccines based on the contribution of BARDA to the physical facility. But along with companies may not having an interest in producing a vaccine or a drug here, there have been folks that said, well, as we do with the military, there was a law passed in 1933. I think I was about 30 years old then or so, but and signed into law by President Hoover. And the law's been modified, a dozen times, many times for specific items that can be purchased overseas. And I think the last modification had to do with textiles. So these are highly focused laws, but there was some aggravation. And I'm not beating up on any countries here, but I'll tell you the military was upset when they found out that their combat boots were being made by countries that they may be facing in combat. So they're trying to get things more centralized. But understanding that, many of these things, there is no demand that they be built within this country. So we can look at the few laws that exist. They don't specify the product. And, if there are military weapons, we need to build those within our own country. And I have some examples if anybody's ever interested in how it enticed other companies who build these military supplies to actually build facilities in this country so they could participate in the in national defense issues here.
Hey, Glenn, can I comment on that just
Please.
quickly? I think your point is well made, and it gets to an issue that I've been talking about a good bit. Understanding that by and large, government does not manufacture goods. That's the role of the private sector. And if we are going to have private sector do exactly what you're suggesting, that we manufacture those goods here within the US, where we can have maybe some better control over the end product, but there's going to have to be a deep look at how we incentivize those private sector players to do exactly what we want them to do. If we're talking, Eleftherios, about a stockpile and making sure we've got a sufficient stockpile so that companies are producing goods that will carry us through a pandemic. Not that we need them today, but that we may need them 5 years from now. If we're going to ask companies to do that, then we have to realize that there must be an incentive for them to conduct their business in that way. And so we're having to take a hard look at what those incentives ought to be, and actually what the stockpile levels ought to be, and where we stockpile and how we move those things, goods, during times of pandemic or national disaster, a whole range of issues there. But at the root of all of that is just the incentive question. What will it take to get companies to understand that it's not just a good thing to do, but that it is also in your financial interest as a corporation to engage in this kind of conduct?
If I can just jump in on that point, Thurbert. Last month, BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority within HHS, they put out a solicitation for about 36 or 37 generic drug active ingredients for over about a 6-year period. And that's an offer for companies to produce product for the strategic national stockpile. And for things like that, what companies need is they need customers. They need someone who will pay them to do it. And maybe, Glenn, what you were talking about with the vaccine manufacturing, I remember maybe this is the same situation, flu vaccines. We had a shortage of like 50 million doses of flu vaccines in the early 2000s because there was a company in the UK that for whatever reason couldn't deliver it right before flu season. And that prompted Congress to actually contract with companies in a couple states to set up flu vaccine manufacturing facilities to make sure we had it here, because there was a season when we wouldn't have had it. So I think when we talk about what's important, it's those critical products that are necessary for the health and well-being and even survival of people. And I'll add, one thing that I've learned from all this work I've been doing is we can't make any antibiotics here in the US. We can't make penicillin anymore. We can't make any of the antibiotics that you take if you have bronchitis or pneumonia or give to your children or grandchildren for ear infections or even for anthrax exposure. So I think we as a country have to decide from a national health security and national security point of view, this is, biowarfare. We're moving into that arena. Is this a role for the federal government? And if so, what can it be? And you're right, it's incentives. And I think it's really a public-private partnership. That's what we did in World War II when Pfizer and other companies, they got together with the federal government. And in no time, right before Normandy, there was penicillin available. And hundreds of thousands of men survived because they didn't die of infections because we had those antibiotics ready. So it's going to take public-private partnerships and figuring out how to do this. And it's heartening to see that those conversations have already started, but we've got to bring them home. And we need to really ramp up the pace here to do just that.
So I'll make just one quick comment, and I know we've defined the problem well, but I think many of our listeners may not be aware of situations where supply chains are important. For instance, here at Texas A&M University, we have one of the top colleges of veterinary medicine. And a few years ago, we almost didn't, in fact, almost every school in the country, or every school in the country would have been unable to accept an entering freshman class because of a lack of rabies vaccine, which all veterinary students have to receive. And the bottom line is, and I'm not, even going to mention countries, it's not one we've talked about in this conversation. Their facility failed a Food and Drug Administration inspection. And so they shut them down. And so there was no rabies vaccine being manufactured. So everybody thought, well, we're just going to have to not take a class this year until, and since those vaccines were not made in this country, there were issues. So we need to keep a close eye on this. Eventually, we were actually able to find another location who had stockpiled some rabies vaccine, and we were able to get that and use it and continue on. And the facility in this other country was eventually able to, overcome its shortcomings and start manufacturing vaccine again. But I think there are many, many circumstances like this that probably are flying below the radar, where we don't see the impact of the supply chain.
Let me add here some thoughts to what Thurbert just raised up. Stockpiles, Thurbert and Rosalind, so important, right? But we gotta be mindful about perishability issues of our stockpiles. As we find out with the strategic, I know Rosemary, you know that very well, with the strategic stockpiles of N95 masks, right? That were first of all depleted after the swine flu pandemic. They were never replenished, and then nobody kept track of the life cycle of these masks. So they were perishable. Some of them were perishable. But going back to Glen's point of being able to produce them here as opposed to, let's please remind ourselves that a lot of our good friends around the globe have weaponized the production of vaccines. They have limited their capability of other countries to import. And I'm just a student of economics, and I cannot help that but see that China is the only country that will experience a 9-point-something% growth last quarter with public subsidies, right, of certain state-owned companies. Is that perennial fight that I feel very strongly personally about between techno-democracies and technotocracies, right? So in that environment, we gotta think how we can use even production of vaccines. Great former president of A&M, Robert Gates, calls this the soft power of the United States, right? So we gotta be mindful about this. But let me also throw something about incentives, because we didn't discuss at all resilient supply chains. So the government wants resilient supply chains. And I'll tell you what GM is doing, just as a small example, because I would like to throw that as a point of discussion. GM is producing the majority of their engines in Asia, but they do have a manufacturer in the US that produces a small portion of that demand, with the premise that whenever there is a disruption due to pandemics, trade wars, tsunamis, whenever there's a disruption from the Asian manufacturer, the local manufacturer will provide surge demand, ramp up production to meet the demand that cannot be satisfied by the Southeast Asian manufacturer. So this production in the US or somewhere close, such as Mexico, Canada, comes at a higher cost. So that's the cost that GM is paying as an insurance to ensure that its supply chain will be resilient. If we want to migrate to resilient supply chains across pharmaceuticals, PPEs, defense, or other industries, we need to think about who's going to split that cost. Is it going to be just on the public sector? Is it going to be a combination, maybe the feds along with the public sector? Because I can assure you, 6 months after the pandemic will be over, and it will be over like everything else in life, everything is impermanent. The pressures for cost efficiencies in these globalized supply chains, they will force them again in some form of spreading again and being lean. But at the same time, there are other technologies that do allow us to bring back production. And Rosalind, you mentioned that the continuous flow manufacturing, automation, 3D printing that allow us to come back. But resilience costs because I have to have backup suppliers. The single supplier model is off clearly. So I have to have diversified source. I have to have emergency stockpiles, as you guys said, inventory safety stocks across the supply chain, and extra cash. So we have to think as a nation, Rosalind and Thurbert, what is the proper trade-off between that resilience that comes at increased cost and the emphasis we're going to put on cost efficiencies?
That's a great point, Eleftherios. Thank you for raising it. There is a cost for redundancy, and tremendous benefit. And I think events like natural disasters and future pandemics, they're predictable. They're going to happen. And there are costs to having to try to scramble when our supply chains are disrupted. And if you amortize that over a period, the cost of having redundancy, that would be fascinating to see how much benefit it would actually bring to a company, as well as the cost. But in the case of medicines, there's a fascinating story. You have the final price, and then you have what does it cost to manufacture. So a gentleman who's worked in the industry for many years, he went out to buy a 90-day supply of blood pressure medicine called lisinopril. And he went into a pharmacy, and it cost $157.50 for a 90-day supply of this generic drug. And he said, guess how much the manufacturer will be paid for that 90-day supply? It'd be great to have a little poll here in real time to see what people think. I said to him, well, maybe $20. He said, no, $1.
Oh my God, okay.
So the question is, in the price of our products, where's our money going? And how much of it is going to manufacturing? And are we really getting value? And so that's why I look at this consortium, I go back to this nonprofit consortium of hospitals started by the Mayo Clinic and many other large health systems. And they're buying differently. And they have long-term contracts, to your point, Thurbert, about how do we incent, new supply chains. Not this short-term searching for the cheapest price. If it's 5 cents cheaper for a 55-gallon, vat of some chemical, we're not going to do that. If you and I want to set up a company, said we'll pay you a fair price, so you have some predictability and certainty. Now, bear in mind that these are products that have been in shortage. We've had 200 to 300 drugs in shortage in this space, even before coronavirus. We're talking about life-saving drugs that have been rationed even before COVID. So that presents a huge cost to pharmacists working in hospitals who literally scramble. And there was a study done of millions and millions of time spent in terms of dollars. People spend going out and looking for product. I was talking to a doctor at a children's hospital, and they end up buying critical drugs for seriously ill children on the gray market, meaning they're not sure where it comes from. So I think in different markets and different products, we can look at where are the costs that we're paying in terms of human life and just wasted resources. Balance that to having a more certain supply. And I think in the private sector, purchasers can make better informed and more, frankly, rational decisions that help them carry out their business day to day, and in this case, the care of patients. So I think we have to look market by market to see, how do we rationalize it and build in redundancy.
I do think comments, and I do think, as we try to wrestle with that question of incentivizing the private sector, eyes will turn more to the federal government and where they want to spend federal dollars to support the effort. I'm still of the opinion that advanced go-to contracts with the private sector makes sense. We just have to be strategic about, how we engage. I think we've got to do a better job of providing the private sector with a seat at the table so they know exactly where we are going. Some transparency. You've heard me talk a lot about transparency, but we need to be able to give them some transparency into the planning and allow them to participate so that it makes sense, and just greater visibility. in terms of what we're trying to do. And I think those things are going to be critical as we engage this conversation.
Oh, I think that's absolutely right, Thurbert. And, you know, government also, you may not have a lot of people that have knowledge of supply chains and what does it really take. And so that's why government and business really need each other to understand what is it we need, where does it come from, and what do we have, what's worth bringing back here that's essential for our national security and, you know, as first priority.
What a great point, Rosemary. If we look for, is there a single federal entity that can dictate a national supply chain strategy? We're not going to find one.
No.
The efforts are compartmentalized and fragmentized across different agencies, and maybe that's something we can think about, right? We don't see that. We don't see that concerted effort within the federal government. And then I beg to differ very respectfully, to a small note with Thurbert. When we look at the DoD industrial manufacturing supply chain, for example, right? So feds, they do have assets, they do have some plans that, but as you said, Thurbert and Rosalind, they have to be interwoven with private run supply chain stakeholders. And one great challenge there is, how do you make these different monsters that work with different clock times? Allow me to use an MIT term here. They different lead times, different innovation times. How do you make them work together without being afraid of each other to spur innovation for the benefit of the nation while protecting national interests? And that's challenging.
Yeah, it is. And I also think it's valuable to ensure that there's enough space for innovator companies, the smaller, medium-sized companies. We were talking about this in a prep call for this event today, that sometimes the real innovators are not the ones that are well known, but they can provide solutions to help our country in times like this. And how do they get a seat at a table when they may have great technical capability, but not sure how to navigate those waters to get to the right people to say, here, we can help you solve this.
And these small to medium enterprises, these small to medium enterprises are critical for the nation. They provide employment, and at the same time, they're under tremendous pressures. And in our effort, allow me to say, in our thinking of reshoring critical capabilities back to the US, that's the gerund that I will use. Rosemary, we see that we lack often the ecosystem of small to medium enterprises that can support that, right? A best practice that I saw, I just want to share with the audience, the Pentagon during the pandemic started paying earlier companies such as Lockheed, General Dynamics, and then these giants are in turn are paying earlier small to medium suppliers that they have. And that early infusion of cash, Glen, helps them tremendously under times they're under really tremendous economic pressures. So we have to think about how we can support this. Sorry, Rosemary.
No, that's a great point. And I'll just add another dimension, this pandemic and the lockdowns and people operating virtually, what it's prevented is, companies that are looking for new partnerships and new opportunities, that it's very hard to do that virtually. We're not having the trade conferences. We're not having the in-person meetings where people can meet each other and know where there are potential suppliers that might be here domestically. It's a real challenge how to find these new partnerships in this type of environment. That's sort of impeding us in our response effort. And I've heard that from companies saying, I can't go out and meet people. Here's a great capability in an X state, and they can do X, Y, Z to meet a problem, but we can't get out and meet each other and talk and do the deals and help solve critical problems for our country.
Thank you so much for bringing it.
So I'm going to interject. So I know we're going to wait till the conclusion to actually address a few questions, but I think this one is pertinent. And it says that in 2019, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within the Department of Homeland Security identified the largest risk to supply chain security was third-party supplier risk.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Cybersecurity, we have cybersecurity attacks that on the average stay undetected for 180 days. And cybersecurity breach of upstream suppliers is absolutely critical. We have a a leading initiative here at Texas A&M System, and a new manufacturing institute, which we call Secure America for Resilient and Secure Manufacturing Supply Chains, where we bring together cybersecurity, policy, supply chain management, materials manufacturing, to look at that holistically with a passion of fulfilling unique needs of the state that no other institute actually is fulfilling. But I really appreciate the comment by the participant, absolutely.
Yeah, and Glenn, I'll just jump in on that too. I think that point is wisely made. I mean, we see a rise, certainly from our law firm, a global law firm. We see cybersecurity as a key issue, you know, not just for us during times of pandemic, but even when it's not. But we're seeing a rise all across the globe now. And we're seeing a demand by clients, companies, banks, financial institutions, not only asking, but demanding that we do a job and meet standards that will ensure the confidentiality and the security of their data. I've heard a lot of stories about, you know, state players trying to steal, you know, vaccine information and what we're doing on a lot of different fronts in that area. I mean, that is real. And so we have got to be super sensitive, especially in times of pandemic and national crisis, to make sure that we are protecting the information that needs to get protected, and to instill, I think, a level of confidence in those who are spending tons of money, research and development to get to the medicines that we need during a time of pandemic. We've got to ensure that we are protecting that vital data.
Secure and trusted partners in the supply chain are absolutely necessary to have a resilient supply chain, namely a supply chain that can bounce back immediately as soon as possible after a disruption. A disruption could be, as Rosemary said, natural weather related, it could be cybersecurity, it could be pandemic. And I know, Thurbert, you talked before about trust, right? So how do you develop secure and trusted partners that we know that the information, the processes, the products that are sent across the supply chains are safe? So security is not just cybersecurity, it's actually physical security. And allow me to say here, since we're at the Bush School, it's also economic security.
Right, absolutely.
Very good, very good. So if it sounds like I'm drifting in a little bit of different direction here, it's because I'm starting to read some of the questions that have been put forth. So this is, I might fall into the political arena, so I'm not sure who would be most appropriate, probably not me. But recently,
I'm living.
Yeah, we recently had a presentation associated with the Bush Foundation, and it was, you know, what might the usages of vaccine be if it were developed by other countries, and you know, the large producers of the economic powerhouses, if you will, that would have the ability to produce vaccines. And they were talking about the production of a new Cold War. Now, our solution to this has been, well, momentarily we'll have our own vaccine, and we're going to make it in sufficient quantities that we would hopefully dampen down the inclination for folks to do that. But you can see where, you know, and again, we're not here to beat up on anybody, but you know, the Russians claim to have a vaccine, and they, you know, could use it as a tool to their advantage. Chinese are, you know, bright, and they'll eventually have a vaccine, and, you know, maybe could distribute it in the regions of the South China Sea that, you know, was in their best interest. And I'm just looking for some feedback that would tell me that there would be no good reason for them to do this.
Yeah, Glenn, I'll just jump in here. You know, with our medicines, the Food and Drug Administration is charged with ensuring the safety and effectiveness of drug products. And just on the safety front, let alone, you know, does it work? Are they produced in a way that's consistent with what's called good manufacturing practices, or GMP? And the gold standard for years for the FDA to protect the American people is that they go in and do very intensive inspections of manufacturing facilities. They might spend 2 weeks in a plant, in a large-sized plant, to ensure that the processes are followed, because it's a very technical thing to make product to exact specifications, because lives depend on it. And what's happened, again, another result of the pandemic is that the FDA has recalled all of its inspectors from other countries. And that began in February or March of this year. So the FDA is not in manufacturing facilities taking a look to see if the products that are being sold here in the United States are being made as they should. And when I wrote China RX, you can see that, the FDA issues warning letters to manufacturers. We had the biggest recall in the world in 2018 when there was a blood pressure medicine found to have rocket fuel chemicals in it. And the FDA went into the plant and found that the company knowingly sold product to the United States and more than 20 other countries with the amount of carcinogen was 200 times the acceptable limit per pill. So that's what the FDA can find upon inspections, but without that process, we have a hard time knowing if these products are being made to ensure that the public safety. And I think it's going to be a very long time before, the FDA has been having trouble finding people to actually go in these plants, go into certain countries to do these inspections. You don't want to be the one federal employee that's going to stop the line on a big export from a local company. So it's a very challenging situation. And I come out and I say publicly now that we're basically importing unregulated products. So that applies to whether it's generic drugs, branded products made around the world, or even now vaccines. We've got to make sure that we understand what we're getting. And frankly, they have to be tested. Every batch has to be tested, which we don't even do now. But I think for something as important for this, that will help assure the confidence of the American people.
So there's an interesting question here based on a comment from Rosemary, and it's why can't we manufacture antibiotics in this country? You might understand where if it's bulk raw materials that aren't available here, there's an issue, and folks might say, well, we can get anything. And I would remind everyone of the issue we had a few years ago with rare earths, which is, those things in a very specific area of the periodic table and aren't available in the United States, but are used in electronics and military applications. And that it was held over our head for at least a bit. You want to comment on that, or the rare earth situation, or the why can't we manufacture antibiotics, and I'll add to that, cost effectively.
Sure. Well, in 2004, the last penicillin plant, it was up in New York, owned by Bristol Myers Squibb. They announced they were closing, and they once produced 70% of the global supply. And the research I have done, and with help from the industry in Europe, they really had data showing that there was cartel formation and dumping. Like with the steel industry, you sell it at a below market price on the global market and keep it low for a number of years. And what you do is you drive out your competitors. So that's why we don't make penicillin anymore. That's why we don't make vitamin C, aspirin. It was what Eleftherios was referring to earlier. When you have sort of an countries with industrial policies, and we have, more of a market-based, and when we don't enforce market principles and the rules of the game, that's violation of, Sherman Antitrust Act. So our free market system has not been allowed to be free, and it's not that the world doesn't operate on that note. So that's in part how we lost it. But how do we bring that back? For things that are essential for life. And I think there are clearly ways to do it in public-private partnerships. to reestablish that capability here in our country. But that's how we lost it.
You know, people have, you know, spoken to me about this, and, you know, folks will say we should implement the Buy American Act of 1933. But many, after reading the law, say that it's really not applicable, and what we need is a new law, which would focus on what you're referring to as those life-saving issues that are important to our populace, as well as to our national defense, to the military or whatever. That you know, someone would have to champion that. And,
Sure. Or we can just be smart and say we need to do this, and let's have money from BARDA or another place, have a public-private partnership. Let's hope that we can have a lot of wisdom here. And I'm really impressed with a number of people across the board who are realizing that we need to act. It's really impressive. We just need to keep it going and get it moving.
And I think, Rosemary, I agree. I think that's where we're going to go. I mean, I'm encouraged by the participation that we're seeing globally now and around the U.S., in particular about those things, in particular medicines that we know are critical during pandemics, and whether or not we have those available readily here in the U.S. is a question that's on everybody's mind. And so I'm hopeful that this experience, if nothing else, will cause us to revisit that discussion and where we can find public-private partnerships to re-engage on those kind of vital medicines that we know are going to be needed, that activity will ensue.
Yeah, it's like our portfolios, you diversify. You know, not have all your eggs in one basket, but we diversify, and that's just smart. Given today's world, you don't have all of your plants in the United States in a single, you know, city or a few states. You have them spread around the country. So it's about diversify, diversify, diversify.
You know, that level, Rosemary and Thurbert, I think it's not coincidental that my antennas are picking up more discussions about potentially developing industrial policies in the United States. I know it's a faux pas kind of jargon that we haven't touched for decades. But going back to the point, if we compete with, there is a reverberation today, right? Because of China having benefited by being out of COVID first. And the backlash came due to the increased trade surplus from West Europe plus the US. So whenever we compete with entities, state-owned companies that capitalize industrial policy, it seems to me that we have to play on some kind of equitable turfs. And I think revisiting or updating industrial policies without, of course, resorting to stifling the private sector, it might make sense.
You know, that's a very interesting point. I remember there's a member of Congress, I was testifying on Capitol Hill. They said, can you explain in a nutshell the challenge we face? I said, the challenge we face is, say if the four of us here wanted to start a company to make X. And we're in countries that we have companies with governments with industrial policies. We're competing not with those companies.
Okay.
We're competing with their governments.
Exactly.
And we can't win that. Nobody can win that.
I couldn't have said it better.
Okay, so we're getting close here. If there are any other questions that need to be sent in, go ahead and send them. There's someone made a comment here, obviously, who is at least well read, about just building infrastructure for things like vaccine production, and it's cryptic, but they were talking about dual use of some of these facilities, and so I'll mention at least one country, and that is that there's an incredible facility that was just constructed in North Korea, and with huge fermentation capability, which would allow them to grow microorganisms that could be used for vaccine production. And when asked about the facility, they said they were building it to produce a microorganism called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is an agricultural chemical or organism. And the truth is, if you look at their agricultural industry, they have no basic need for that organism, but it's also exactly the same facility, and I mean exactly the same facility in which you would grow Bacillus anthracis, which is anthrax. If you were going to grow weapons grade anthrax, that's where it would come from. So again, I'm not beating up on anybody. I'm just telling you that you need to keep your eyes open as you're looking at other countries' capabilities and what it is they're doing. And maybe the public-private partnership is the way for us to capitalize on, the security assets that we have at our national level to keep our private sector, with its head above water.
Well, to your point, Glenn, after the anthrax attacks in the United States, in New York, with the media and on Capitol Hill, in post offices in New Jersey and elsewhere, the federal government wanted to buy 20 million doses of doxycycline, which is an antidote for anthrax exposure. And we didn't make it here. So the US government turned to a very reputable company in Europe, and they in turn had to get the raw material from a country that invested as part of its industrial policy in raw material production for antibiotics in Asia. So you have, the organism, and then you have the antidote.
Right. Or if you grow large quantities in those distillation facilities, you could potentially manufacture a vaccine. So you just need to, like I say, need to keep your eyes open. And, I don't want the government looking over my shoulder at every step, but there are some steps in which I'd be more than happy for them to take a leadership role.
If I can add the thought just on the word infrastructure and industrial policy in the US, if we really want to support this new resource manufacturing supply chains, should also build upon upgrading the infrastructure of the country, logistics infrastructure, motorways, rails, intermodal transportation with ports. These are critical. And since I have such a sophisticated panel here, I mean, we can discuss at one point in time the short-termism of many of us, including in academia, industry, and politicians, hasn't allowed the country to make that investment. So infrastructure is critical. And for North Korea, I cannot help but tell a joke, right? So that could be a country that every sector of the economy is critical, right, Glenn? Since we talk about critical sectors for the economy.
Yep. Okay, folks, I think we're getting close to our time here. Lauren, are you going to say bad things to me within the next couple of minutes, or are we about done?
I don't think I have anything bad to say about you.
Okay, I'm just checking. Let me make sure I have any other questions that have been sent in. So at least one person said, if Rosemary would make some additional comments about generating generic drugs, maybe an ethical or in a transparent manner, that they found that to be highly interesting.
It is a fascinating development and innovation, again, coming from new entrants in the marketplace who are finding solutions to a very serious problem that's been going on for a long time. And it required the big buyers, in this case hospitals, to use their procurement dollars differently, to invest in production in a supply chain that is trustworthy, that has redundancy built in, that's inspected, tested. And they do it because it's good for people and their lives. I've been in hospitals where, cardiologists have said, I'm not sure if this generic drug is working on a patient post, open heart surgery. There's a lot of serious flaws with those generic drugs. So there are people stepping up to the plate to find solutions. And I'm on the board of a new entity that is going to be doing advanced manufacturing of generic drugs end to end. And the motto is country before company. And so we'll have full production here in the United States of critical generic drugs that are necessary for life in the best of times, and certainly during periods of the pandemic. So that's why I say we need room for new entrants, new entities that want to come in and help solve a problem. And there's good people here that want to do it. And let's, bring them together with government, and we can do great things together.
Okay, so thank you, Rosemary, and actually thank you, Thurbert and Eleftherios. I'm more enthused about this subject matter, I guess, than I've ever been. And talking about the potential for public-private interactions, but hopefully, as time goes on, we'll learn more about this. I've got to tell you that, so I have my ear to the ground on these sorts of things, and this is one of the real, or the first open discussions that I've heard about this from a variety of perspectives. Everyone, thinking about, vaccines and whatever, which is all, all good. But the maybe not identifying one of the weakest links in the chain, which is, our ability to get the raw materials, make things that we need, and get them where they need to be, the supply chain. Okay, so I guess we can bring this to a conclusion. If I assume that Lauren is the one who can do that.
Thank you all so much. It has been a privilege participating.
Thank you. This was
Glenn, Thurbert, Rosemary, thank you.
Thank you, Glen.
Thank you, everyone. Great
Yeah.
panel. Thank you so much.
Yep. Maybe they'll have us back sometime.
Under popular demand, I hope.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah.
If not, we should do it anyway ourselves. This is so important.
Yeah.
And there's a ton of interest, and we need to inspire young people that this is a future to understand supply chain and how important it is. And I'm very optimistic that with the energy and innovation and ideas and partnerships, we can really make a difference here.
Rosemary and Thurbert, you inspired me, and I'm telling you seriously here, you have my support in any way that I can help at any point in time.
Same here.
We should get together and come up with some good things to work on together. I really enjoy that.
I'm very serious about this.
Me too.
There could be a manuscript in this.
Yeah, we'll do that too. Yeah.
I also want to do something.
Oh yes, of course.
God forbid. But I love that country over company.
Yeah, I like that.
Isn't that beautiful?
It's beautiful.
That's the thing that we need now. And I just want to say, I'll be honest with you, I've been contacted by folks, and no one pays me I do this because I care. No one pays me to do this. And there are folks from the venture capital space who are interested. And I said, this is something that you have to invest in for the long haul. This isn't something about coming in and, in 2 years, get out.
Not a get rich quick.
This is so important. And I'll tell you, the fruits of it will be very beneficial over that long haul. People can stick with it for the long haul, because we're going to need these things for years to come. It's more like a public utility model. And it's fair to consumers in terms of pricing, fair to taxpayers. And, we can really solve a problem. So I'm very excited about, this conversation we've had here. And I hope we can take it to the next level and come back and maybe share it with the students and others at Texas A&M Community, Scowcroft Institute, to say, how are we solving this? This is what we were saying 6 months ago. Where are we now?
Well, what did we do?
Yeah. If nothing else, this pandemic has reminded us that, the world is not as disconnected as one might think. And the health of one nation really has an impact on the health of another. And so, what we're doing here in the U.S. will make a difference. And I hope we will, stay focused on these concerns and not only be able to better protect U.S. citizens, but protect people around the globe.
So global problems require global solutions.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
And there's a saying from a friend of mine in industry, Rosemary, that you need a leader during the crisis, climate change, if you want, or pandemics, and you need the leader also when there's no crisis, preparing for the crisis, right?
Yes.
So what are we talking about here is, I mean, you touched me so seriously about this. So God bless. I'm honored, and thankful.
Good.
I'm thankful.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Lauren,
Thank you.
you can take it away.
I'm gonna
Thanks,
get,
everyone.
thank you so much, Lauren. I think I have emails from Thurbert and Rosemary through the email list, right? So I'll be, and vice versa. So let's please keep the communication, and also for the white paper that we tend to write.
I'll do an email with everyone's emails on it
Oh,
included.
great, Lauren. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And everybody's, phone numbers too.
I will do that. I will do
I don't
that.
have those, so y'all are going to
But
have to add those.
if you send the email, I'll make sure that I start. I give both of you my phone number so we can stay in touch.
Yeah,
And Thurbert, I really value your wisdom on this.
I'll do the same.
We need your wisdom on this.
No, I'm glad to help. Glad this is critically important to us and me in particular. So no, glad to work with you. Love to.
It's actually been quite exciting in that, many of these things that I do, everybody sitting around the table is from the same background and
Yeah.
has the same insights basically. And that's not what we were doing here.
Going
Sure.
back to the first point that Rosemary made, I learned in my life that whenever I find people which are harmonized in so many ways, it's not a coincidence. I believe in God, so I believe there is a reason that people get together. So
Oh, there's no question.
I appreciate you all. Of you.
Can I be honest? I'm just a private citizen. I have no title,
Oh, yes, you do.
but I don't. And I just
We like you.
I just wrote, honest to God, I just wrote this book and I just started talking to people.
You create miracles.
And,
Yeah.
and good people of goodwill and understanding. We want to fix this, and good people pop up. And someday,
Miraculous ways, yes.
and someday I'll tell you the story of these people that just popped up. And I feel that way about here. I feel a real resonance, and I wish I could come. Invite me down to Texas A&M, and we'll socially distance, and we could
You're my
really.
guest at any point in time, and I'm sure Glenn will echo that. And
Absolutely.
We would love to have you.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, we're going to do that. I'm going to hold you to it. I am really honored, and you've made my day today, all of you.
No, it's
I
been
just
fun.
can't thank you enough.
same Thurbert, the same. I mean it, right? So
No, I'm not. Likewise. Great panel, great friendship, guys. So let's.
yeah, it's amazing how this happened, right? So I feel like I'm speaking with a call with real friends here. Real bond here. That's amazing.
Can I ask a question?
Thank you.
How did you guys find me? I mean, you all know each other. How did you all find me?
Who knows who?
Hey guys.
I read your book at Christmas time, Rosemary, and I came back and I told everyone at Scowcroft about it. And
Oh,
Ed
wow.
Yu is the one that told me to read your book. So
Okay.
And you told me as well. Ed was the one who told me to read it.
Oh, well.
Hey guys, I'm so sorry, but I've got another call that I'm running about 5 minutes late on, so I'm going to have to hop. But I'll assume we will stay in touch, everyone. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Thurbert.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, Eleftherios. Bye,
It
Glen.
was a great
Bye,
pleasure.
Lauren.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you, panelists, and thank you to our audience for staying tuned in.